The year was 2005, and Emma was just a child. At 13, with her innocent smile and wavy brown hair, she seemed like just another girl from a small town in the heartland of the United States. But one summer night, everything changed, something that would mark her for the rest of her life. When Emma's pregnancy was discovered, the town turned against her. The people who had once been her friends now looked at her with judgmental eyes. Her parents, who had always been protective, threw her out of the house, unable to cope with the shame. Emma was sent to live with a distant aunt in a neighboring town, where she became the subject of gossip, muffled laughter, and sideways glances. She was forced to grow up quickly, but what no one knew was that the pain of losing her family, her trust, and her innocence was fueling something much darker inside her. Over the years, Emma worked tirelessly, facing adversity with fierce determination. She raised her son, Jake, with love and care, but carried a quiet anger toward those who had abandoned her. That pain transformed into strength, a flame burning in her chest, feeding an idea that slowly took shape: revenge. Now, nearly a decade later, Emma was back. At 23, she returned to the town that had rejected her, with a clear purpose. She was no longer the fragile, lost girl who had left. Emma had become a strong, successful woman, and most importantly, she had learned how to play the town's game. With an enigmatic smile and an imposing presence, she would walk through the front doors of those who had condemned her and make them all pay for their actions. But no one could have anticipated what would come next. The town of Cedar Falls hadn't changed much over the years. Its main street still exuded that small-town charm, where old stores mingled with newer establishments, striving to balance progress and tradition. Yet beneath its tranquil facade, time had not been kind to everyone, and no one understood that better than Emma. When she returned, the insecure girl who had left in a rush, ashamed and heartbroken, was gone. Emma, now a grown woman, carried herself with confidence. Her long hair was tied back in a simple yet elegant bun, and she wore a business suit that matched her impeccable demeanor. She was no longer an outcast. She was someone who had achieved what she wanted and knew the power she wielded. Jake, her nearly 10-year-old son, walked by her side. He didn't know the full story behind his father's absence or why they had been forced to leave their hometown, but he knew his mother was there to ensure no harm ever came his way. Emma had raised him to be resilient, to never accept being less than anyone else, to rise above the challenges life threw at them. Above all, she wanted him to witness what happened when people were cruel beyond reason. Emma had a meticulous plan. She knew she couldn't confront those who had cast her out without a strategy, without the right pieces in place. So, upon her return, she surrounded herself with allies, people willing to help her fulfill her purpose. One of them was Sarah, her childhood friend, who was now married to the town's police chief, Mark Ellis. Emma knew Sarah had always felt guilty for not standing up for her back then, and now Emma could use that guilt to her advantage. Sarah, despite her position, had never gotten over Emma's departure. She remembered the pain in her friend's eyes when she was sent away, judged as though she were a monster. Sarah also understood how small and cruel Cedar Falls could be, with its endless gossip and judgment. She wanted to help Emma, but feared what that could mean for herself and her family. Another ally was Henry, the town's lawyer. Known for being shrewd and discreet, he had a complicated relationship with the local elite, making him the perfect partner for Emma's plans. He knew exactly how things worked in Cedar Falls' shadows. Henry held secrets everyone wanted, but few dared to ask for: the truth. He knew things that could crumble the town's perfect facade, and Emma was ready to use that to her advantage. As Emma began setting her pieces on the board, she couldn't ignore what her return meant for those who had rejected her, especially her parents Elizabeth and James, who still lived in the same house that had once been her home. Her mother, a religious and conservative woman, had been the driving force behind her expulsion, judging Emma harshly for her mistake. James, her father, had always been more distant, but the pain of seeing her leave coupled with his inability to stand up to Elizabeth, had led him to support her decision. Emma knew rebuilding bridges wouldn't be easy, nor was it her goal. She wanted her parents to feel the weight of what they had done, and knew the best way to do that was to show them that, even though they had closed the door on her, she now held the power. Her revenge wouldn't just be an act of bitterness. It would be a reckoning, a way to return the humiliation they had inflicted on her, a form of justice for herself and everyone who had suffered under the town's hypocrisy. With her plan taking shape, Emma was preparing for the first move. She knew everything depended on timing, on how she made her entrance. She had chosen Cedar Falls' annual gala, an event where everyone gathered to showcase who they were and what they had achieved, as the perfect stage to make her first strike. The annual Cedar Falls gala was just 2 days away, and Emma knew it would serve as the ideal backdrop to deliver her opening blow. The event was a town tradition, a night of elegance where residents came together to celebrate local prosperity, complete with live music, elaborate dinners, and speeches filled with clichés about community pride. But for Emma, it was more than just a party. It was the setting where she would begin exposing the hypocrisies that had always governed life in this town. Alongside Jake, Emma had spent the last few days fine-tuning details with Henry and Sarah. Meanwhile, Mark, the police chief, struggled to conceal his discomfort with Emma's growing influence, but couldn't help noticing how deeply his wife had become involved with her old friend. Sarah, for her part, was nervous. She feared Emma's quest for vengeance might go too far, that she was digging a hole too deep to climb out of. But Emma had convinced her that it was time to put an end to the town's hypocrisy. On the eve of the event, Emma drove past her parents' house, not to visit but to observe. She knew they would never expect her to show her face again after all these years, especially not with a child in tow. Elizabeth and James still lived in the same house where Emma had grown up, but to her it no longer seemed inviting. The old home now exuded an emptiness, as if the years had soaked up the coldness her parents had once shown her. As the town geared up for the big night, Emma, with her newfound confidence, was ready. When she arrived at the venue, an imposing building that mirrored the town's self-importance, she wasn't intimidated. All eyes turned to her as soon as she walked in. The black dress she wore was simple, but perfectly tailored, and her now shorter hair framed her face with effortless elegance. She carried herself with the poise of someone who knew exactly where the power lay, and everyone in the room could see it. The moment she stepped into the hall, the tension in the air rose. Conversations halted, and a faint unease rippled through the crowd. Emma allowed herself a faint smile, knowing the time had come to make her first move. She made her way to Sarah, who stood by the bar with a glass of champagne in hand, trying to mask her anxiety. "You came," Sarah said, a mix of surprise and relief in her voice. "Are you ready for this?" Emma gave her a knowing smile. "Yes, I'm ready. The first move is yours." Sarah swallowed hard. "I'm not sure I can do this. Mark won't like it." "Sarah," Emma said firmly, "stop thinking about Mark. Think about me. Think about everything they did. This isn't just about justice, it's about vengeance." Sarah hesitated, but Emma's words planted a seed of resolve. "I'll do what you asked," Sarah said at last, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But this is risky, really risky." "That's fine. You're doing the right thing. I'll handle the rest." Emma left Sarah and moved toward the center of the room, where familiar faces began to emerge. The town was filled with people who had judged her, but none of them knew how much she had changed. She was no longer the vulnerable young girl they had cast aside. She was a determined woman, ready to upend their lives. On stage, the town's mayor, David Harris, took the microphone to deliver the night's opening speech. With an air of arrogance, he spoke about the town's achievements, its pride, and the unique bond of the community. Emma listened intently, her eyes locked on her parents, who stood near the stage. Elizabeth, impeccably dressed, carried a nervous energy barely concealed beneath her composed exterior. James looked uneasy, as though he were present out of obligation. As always. When the mayor finished, Emma stood. A murmur swept through the room as heads turned toward her. She walked confidently to the stage, took the microphone, and faced the crowd. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "My name is Emma. Maybe some of you remember me, maybe you don't." The room fell into a tense silence. "In 2005, I was cast out of this town. I was rejected for becoming a mother at 13. Judged by all of you, by my family, by my friends, and especially by those who thought they had the right to decide who I should be. But unlike what you all believed, I survived. I grew. And yes, I raised my son Jake, alone, far from here, far from the town that labeled me a disgrace. Now I'm back, and I'm here to deliver justice." The murmur turned into a buzz. Wide eyes, pale faces, and an overwhelming sense of discomfort spread across the room. Emma's words weren't just the truth, they were the opening act of her revenge. The town had discarded her, and now she was back to tear apart those whose hypocrisy had caused her so much pain. After her impactful speech, Emma felt a surge of power coursing through her veins. People were visibly unsettled, some trying to avoid her gaze, others staring with a mixture of fascination and fear. But the true fallout would come later, as the consequences of her words began to unravel. Sarah stood in a corner of the room, her heart racing. The pressure was almost unbearable. She knew Emma had set the wheels in motion, but the weight of what was about to happen made her stomach churn. The first phase of the plan was already in play. She had spread a rumor about a major revelation Emma would make during the event. She knew it would spark curiosity and uncertainty, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly it would spiral out of control. Meanwhile, Mark, the police chief, stood at the bar chatting with a few friends, though the tension was etched into his every movement. He was acutely aware of Sarah's involvement with Emma, and it deeply unsettled him. Though he tried to appear calm, the thought of Sarah's rekindled friendship with the girl he knew only as trouble gnawed at him. His instincts screamed that something was about to happen. He couldn't quite pinpoint what, but the sensation of being both watched and manipulated lingered, making him restless. Then, Emma made her next move. She wasn't there just to confront her parents in the town. She intended to expose the hypocrisy running through everyone's veins. Silently, she handed an envelope to Henry, the lawyer. The man gave a subtle smile, his expression composed, but his eyes betraying his awareness of the storm brewing. "It's time to reveal the truth," Emma told Sarah, who watched her with worried eyes. "Things will never be the same after tonight." Henry rose from his seat, walking with a quiet confidence toward the stage, interrupting the hum of conversation that followed Emma's speech. He took the microphone, his voice steady and authoritative as it echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have something serious to address. Something that many of you likely didn't know, but which should have come to light long ago." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. Emma could see the unease settling over the crowd. Some were confused, others clearly aware of what was coming. Her father, James, looked paler than ever, while her mother, Elizabeth, began to sweat, visibly shaken. They were in shock, and Emma knew this was only the beginning. In 2005, when Emma was cast out of her home and this town, many of you had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. As the city's legal counsel, I recently uncovered a series of falsified documents and forged contracts involving Emma's parents and other key figures in Cedar Falls. These were created to ensure that the shame of a teenage pregnancy would remain hidden at the expense of Emma's reputation and the truth. The room fell into an eerie silence. Emma knew this revelation would not only destroy her parents' carefully constructed image, but also shake the town's trust in its leaders. All eyes were now on Elizabeth and James, who appeared more like strangers than the upstanding figures everyone believed them to be. Hearing Henry's words, Mark felt panic grip him. He realized Emma's secret was being laid bare and Sarah was somehow entangled in it. The guilt gnawed at him, and the dread of what was about to unfold left him tense and uncertain. He didn't know how to react. Emma watched the scene unfold with a calm demeanor, a faint smile masking her satisfaction. She felt she had taken the first step in making everyone see what she had always known. The lies of Cedar Falls were finally being exposed. She wasn't alone anymore. She had allies, and now she had control. But Henry's revelation didn't stop at Emma's parents. He went on to expose other secrets about the town, illegal deals, election manipulation, and even the involvement of some of the town's most respected citizens in shady activities. Emma knew these truths wouldn't be easy for the town to swallow, but there was no turning back now. She was determined to dismantle the very foundation of the town's hypocrisy. As the weight of Henry's words began to ripple through the room, conversations turned hushed and tense. Some people tried to slip away, while others exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak up. The town that once rejected Emma was now slowly crumbling, and she was only getting started. The fallout from Henry's revelations was still settling when Emma noticed something she hadn't anticipated. A familiar figure was approaching her slowly, his expression leaving no doubt about his intentions. It was Mark, the police chief. He appeared visibly nervous, but his measured demeanor kept suspicion at bay. Still, the tension in his shoulders and the piercing look in his eyes made it clear he knew the situation was spiraling out of control. "Emma," Mark said, his voice firm as he came closer. His serious expression sent a chill through the air. "We need to talk." Emma stood firm, her resolve unwavering. This wasn't the first time Mark had tried to intimidate her, but now she held something far more powerful. He was about to realize that his authority in the town and the control he thought he had over her was crumbling, but instead of reacting as he expected, Emma met him with an icy calmness. "Go ahead, Mark. What do you have to say? I see you're more bothered by what's unfolding than by the truth finally coming to light." Mark hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the corner where Sarah stood, visibly uncomfortable and unsure of how to handle the situation. The tension between them was impossible to ignore. "I'm no fool, Emma. I know you did this to tear down everything we've built here. Your revenge won't go unanswered," Mark said, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea what you're risking. Keep this up, and you'll end up worse off than before." Emma let out a soft, almost mocking laugh. She understood the threat he posed, but the pain of the past had prepared her for this moment. She wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm not tearing anything down, Mark. I'm just making sure the truth is finally seen. You should be more worried about what's being exposed than about anything I could do." Mark stepped closer, his tone now more serious. "Do you really think this is going to end well for you? That this little game of revenge will have a happy ending? You're playing with fire, Emma, and you're going to get burned." Emma locked eyes with him, not a trace of hesitation in her gaze. "I've already been burned, Mark. You have no idea what that's like. The difference now is that I have nothing left to lose, unlike you, who has so much to hide." The tension in the room grew thicker. Sarah, who had been silently observing the exchange from a distance, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She realized things were spiraling into a more dangerous place than she had anticipated. While Emma was in control for now, the stakes were rising, and the consequences could be devastating for everyone involved. That was when Henry, the lawyer, approached Emma. His calculating expression made it clear he was more involved in the plan than she had realized. "It's time to take the next step," he said calmly, though there was a sense of urgency in his voice that made Emma understand this was far from over. "We need to make sure none of this can be undone. The mayor won't take the loss of control lightly." Henry was right. Mayor David Harris was clearly desperate. He had stepped away from the scene, trying to coordinate a response to the revelations. But it wasn't just him. Other key figures in town, the local doctor, the head of the private school, and even the banker, were beginning to realize that the public exposure of their secrets posed a very real threat. Emma didn't need to say anything else. She knew the game had escalated to a much larger scale. This wasn't just about personal revenge anymore. It had grown into something corporate, systematic. She didn't care what Mark or anyone else thought. Her goal was clear: to dismantle Cedar Falls' carefully crafted facade once and for all. Amid the rising tension, an unexpected ally emerged. It wasn't Sarah, as Emma had assumed, but someone even more surprising: her own mother, Elizabeth. She approached Emma with an expression full of deep sadness and a hint of regret. I didn't know you would go this far, Emma. We thought we could just erase that chapter of your life, Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. I know we were cruel, but you have no idea what we went through. Emma stared at her mother, her face devoid of empathy. Elizabeth, with all her excuses and explanations, couldn't undo what had already been done. But Elizabeth, desperate, continued, If you destroy everything we've built here, you'll destroy our family too. I don't want to lose you, Emma. I'm sorry for everything. Silence hung between them. Emma felt the weight of her mother's words, but she couldn't give in. The years of abandonment and rejection couldn't be healed by simple apologies. She had to keep going. It was the only way she knew. I already lost you all, Mom, Emma replied, her voice colder than she intended. Now you'll have to live with the consequences. The turning point was set. Emma knew things would only get worse from here, but she was no longer willing to back down. She had made her choice to bring down the town that had rejected her, and now she knew there was no turning back. The atmosphere in Cedar Falls shifted irreversibly. The once seemingly peaceful and safe town was now consumed by palpable unease. People no longer spoke loudly in the streets. Whispers filled the air. Henry's revelations had not only exposed Emma's parents' secrets, but also unveiled the corrupt system that sustained the entire town. Suddenly, everything that seemed perfect was nothing but a facade, and the truth was collapsing like a house of cards. Sarah was caught in the eye of the storm. She knew her relationship with Emma could no longer continue without profound changes. As she silently watched her mother, she reflected on how things had reached this breaking point. Guilt and confusion consumed her. On one hand, she loved Emma like a sister and understood the pain the girl had endured. On the other hand, the weight of the revelations affected her deeply. She still loved Mark, and his position as police chief only heightened her sense of being torn in two. Standing before the mirror, Sarah tried to gather the courage to face the situation. She knew her mother was past the point of no return. Elizabeth had already succumbed to the pressure. But what would Mark do now? Sarah feared his reaction would be far more drastic than she could imagine. There was something in his demeanor, in his attitude, that suggested he was prepared to do whatever it took to regain control of the town and avoid further humiliation. Meanwhile, the greatest impact was being felt by Emma's parents. Elizabeth could hardly bring herself to look at her daughter. Overwhelmed with guilt, she finally realized that all the years spent justifying what they had done to Emma in order to protect the family's image had come at a far greater cost than she could have ever anticipated. James, on the other hand, was completely unhinged. The man who had always portrayed himself as the pillar of Cedar Falls now seemed like a puppet, his strings mercilessly pulled by Emma. He spent his days in a state of denial, trying to minimize the impact of the revelations. But like everyone else, he knew there was no escape. The pressing question now was how the other residents of the town would react. Mark was already in a precarious position. With the public exposure of his involvement in political manipulations and his ties to key figures in the town, his role as police chief was hanging by a thread. Mayor David Harris, who had always spearheaded the town's operations, was also taking desperate measures to erase the mounting evidence. But the political machine he had so carefully built would never be the same again. The day after the revelations was marked by confrontations. Sarah found herself caught in an increasingly deep dilemma. Mark, her mother, and even other influential members of the community began pressuring her to convince Emma to back down and try to regain control of the situation. But as she looked at the girl who had once been her friend, she knew reversing what was happening was impossible. The town was on the verge of being toppled by a wave of truths, and no one was immune. That night, Mark came home earlier than usual. His mind was restless, unable to focus on anything. Emma's words still echoed in his ears. The threats, the coldness in her voice, and the way the town had treated her, all of it consumed him. But what tormented him the most was the realization that Emma was now in control. He tried calling Sarah, but she didn't pick up. Mark knew she was torn, that she no longer believed the excuses he and others had used over the years. He needed to find a way to regain control, but he had no idea where to start. He couldn't let the town fall into the hands of someone so determined to destroy everything he had built. Emma, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of power. Everything was falling into place just as she had planned. The reactions she provoked were the fuel driving her quest for revenge. Yet at the same time, she felt a growing emotional detachment. The pain of the past was being replaced by an unrelenting coldness. The guilt that had haunted her for so many years was gone. Now, all that remained was the need to finish what she had started. However, Emma didn't yet realize that her actions would have unforeseen consequences. A new ally was about to emerge, someone she never could have imagined, someone who would not only help solidify her revenge, but also bring to light something much darker and more dangerous for everyone involved. As Emma watched the town crumble under the weight of its own lies, she felt a subtle satisfaction. But there was something nagging at her, something that kept her from feeling completely at ease. She wasn't sure she was ready for what was coming next, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't back down. Revenge was a fire burning inside her, and no one, not even the ties of the past, could extinguish it. The days that followed were dark and chaotic. Cedar Falls, once a peaceful town, now lived in the shadow of the storm Emma had unleashed. Every corner seemed to hide a secret. Every face on the street bore an expression of fear and unease. Emma's revelations had shattered the town's facade, leaving everyone to face the consequences of their own sins. Emma herself found herself immersed in a sea of conflicting emotions. The revenge she had so meticulously planned was turning into something far bigger than she had anticipated. Each step she took toward dismantling the figures who had rejected her brought her a bittersweet pleasure. For the first time, she felt truly seen, her pain acknowledged. Most importantly, she held the reins of the fate of those who had scorned her. As the weeks passed, Emma began to feel a growing emptiness within her soul. Her relationship with Sarah, which once reflected a genuine friendship, was now marred by distrust. Sarah didn't know where to stand anymore. She was torn between her love for Emma and her loyalty to her family. More than that, she felt the loss of the bond they once shared, a friendship that now seemed irreparable. No matter how hard she tried, Sarah couldn't reconcile the image of the vengeful Emma who now dominated the town. Emma knew Sarah was drifting away, but she felt powerless to change it. She poured herself into her actions, her control, and the influence she had over those around her. Each meeting with Henry, every exchange of information with her allies, fueled her sense of power. But in her solitude, she began to question whether she was truly seeking justice or simply trying to fill the deep void within her. One of those long nights, sitting alone in her room, Emma received a text from her mother. Elizabeth had asked for a meeting. Emma hesitated before replying. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure she wanted to hear her mother's excuses again, or worse, face more accusations about her choices. Yet something inside her, a vague, inexplicable need to understand what remained between them, compelled her to accept. Late that night, Emma made her way to the old cafe in town, a quiet and nearly deserted place. Elizabeth sat at a table by the window, her eyes weary, her face pale. Emma watched her for a moment before sitting down without saying a word. "Emma," Elizabeth began, her voice low and heavy with regret, "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But what you're doing, it won't bring you peace. I thought that by keeping you away from the town and all the people who hurt you, I was protecting you. I wanted to give you a chance to escape it all." Emma took a deep breath, her gaze fixed firmly on her mother. "Protect me? You took me away from everything and everyone. You threw me away like I was a mistake to be hidden. You never thought about me, Mom. You thought about yourself, about how the town would see you, about how they would see you. Elizabeth lowered her head, her entire body seeming to shrink under the weight of her daughter's condemnation. I did what I thought was right, but I didn't realize it would destroy you like this. And now, seeing what you've done, I see that maybe, just maybe, I've destroyed you even more." There was a heaviness in her mother's words that made Emma feel something she couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was regret, or perhaps just the last flicker of a desperate attempt to rebuild what had been broken. Emma felt distant from it all, but at the same time, part of her wondered, what was she really seeking by tearing the town apart? Was she avenging herself, or merely trying to heal the deep wounds of abandonment? "I'm not trying to heal anything, Mom. I'm just trying to be seen." Emma's response came as a sharp, painful truth. She looked at her mother, her eyes cold and unyielding. "And the only way to do that is to destroy everything that ignored me, everything that forgot me." Elizabeth didn't know what else to say. She couldn't tell whether her daughter sought revenge or understanding. But one thing was clear. Emma had changed. She was no longer the frightened, insecure girl who had left Cedar Falls all those years ago. She was now a woman who had seized control of her destiny, a woman who knew pain and had learned how to wield it to her advantage. As Emma walked away from the table, an incomplete feeling lingered within her. She had gained so much power, so much control, but what had she truly earned? The ruins of Cedar Falls lay before her, yet inside she couldn't feel the satisfaction she had imagined. Deep down, she knew her battle wasn't just with those who had hurt her, but with the woman she had become. Vengeance, far from making her stronger, was only leaving her more vulnerable. Emma still had a long road ahead, and revenge would not be the end of her journey. She was beginning to realize that to truly free herself, she might have to abandon this path of destruction, or at least find another way forward. But what was left for her? What could she do now that the town was already scarred by her pain? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. The real battle wasn't out there. It was within herself. The weeks that followed were marked by an eerie silence in Cedar Falls. After Emma's revelations, the town was adrift, its residents trapped in fear and shame. No place was immune to judgmental stares, and even the most powerful tried to maintain appearances. Though the cracks in their facades were plain for all to see, the tension was palpable, like a storm about to break. Emma, however, knew the final confrontation was near. She felt she couldn't back down now. Everything she had done so far, all the revelations, the betrayals, the control she had seized, was building toward a single decisive moment. Cedar Falls teetered on the edge of collapse, and Emma held the power to decide who or what would survive the fallout. Sarah, still conflicted, had become a spectator in her own life. She had distanced herself from Mark, but that didn't free her from the pain of watching her city, her family, and even herself being dragged toward the abyss. She tried to cope with the weight of guilt, but the tensions between her and Emma were uncontrollable. Their friendship, the bond she once believed to be unbreakable, had unraveled. And now, even though she stood by Emma's side, Sarah didn't know how to stop what was about to happen. She felt like the game was already lost. Mark, the police chief, was at the center of the storm. His interactions with Emma had intensified, and now he saw his life and career crumbling around him. Emma had manipulated him, exposed him in ways he hadn't imagined, and the constant threat that she could do even more kept him in a state of controlled panic. He knew he could no longer trust anyone. Even his own team members, who had once owed him loyalty, were now distancing themselves from him, fearing the city was heading in a direction he couldn't control. However, Mark's biggest concern wasn't the loss of power, but what Emma might still do to ensure he paid for his transgressions. The biggest unknown, however, was Henry's move. The young man who had become Emma's ally throughout the process and who had helped shed light on the actions of the powerful in Cedar Falls had his own motivations. Henry wasn't just helping Emma out of a sense of revenge or justice. He had a much broader plan, something Emma still didn't fully understand. He knew the city was on the brink of collapse, but what did he really want? Behind his facade of loyalty, there was something darker and more calculated. The highest point of tension came one sweltering afternoon when Emma received an unsigned letter. Upon opening it, she found only one sentence written in flawless handwriting. "Nothing will ever be the same. Everything is about to change." Deet, a chill ran down her spine, a sense that the pieces of the game were shifting, and she no longer had absolute control. Who else knew about her plans? Who else was playing the game more deeply than she was? But at the same time, a part of Emma believed that no one could stop her revenge now. She was too deep in the pain, in the resentment to turn back. As she walked through the streets of Cedar Falls, Emma noticed the wary looks from the people around her. Some avoided her, others whispered, but everyone saw her differently now. She was an outsider, an unstoppable force that had unmasked the town's deepest secrets. Fear was on every face she passed, but Emma felt no pity. She knew what she had done had to be done, even if she had paid an immense emotional price. The situation, however, was about to take an unexpected turn. Sarah, feeling pressured by her own guilt and the growing separation from Emma, finally decided to take a stand. She knew her loyalty to Mark no longer made sense. He was lost, just like her mother. She no longer wanted to be part of a game where the rules were dictated by fear, shame, and betrayal. So, Sarah sought out Henry. The conversation between the two was brief, but significant. Henry, with his enigmatic smile, seemed to see beyond Sarah's pain. He knew she was on the brink of an important decision, and he was willing to help her take the next step. "You don't have to choose between both sides anymore," Henry said. "You can become something more. The city is broken, but you have the power to rebuild it. Join us." Sarah looked at him, unsure whether she was hearing a promise or a disguised threat. But instead of responding immediately, she simply observed the man who, like Emma, had played his own game, manipulating the people around him without hesitation. Emma, on the other hand, had no idea what was forming in the shadows. She felt like a storm, ready to hit its peak. She knew the true moment was coming. Cedar Falls could no longer be what it once was. The city was irreversibly broken, and with it, all its inhabitants. She, however, felt that her end was closer than she had imagined. What she didn't know was that before reaching the peak of her revenge, Emma would face a surprise that could change the course of her story. A revelation she wasn't prepared to handle. The city of Cedar Falls was about to be consumed by a fire that would not be easily extinguished. Everything Emma had done up to this point, every action, every revelation, every piece of her revenge, was converging toward a single moment. She felt in control, as if she finally had the power to make things right, but deep down, something inside her began to question whether that would truly make her happy. Revenge, after everything that had happened, no longer seemed like enough. That's when the mysterious letter appeared, and something in Emma changed. What once seemed like absolute control over the events in the city began to crumble, like a house of cards. Who had sent the letter? How did they know so much about her plans? Doubt grew in her mind, but she pushed those thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to weaken now. That night, the city was silent, a tense silence, heavy with expectation. Emma knew something was about to happen, but she didn't know exactly what. She met with Henry, as planned, in the old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Henry, who always seemed to wear a calculating smile, was more serious than usual. "Are you ready, Emma?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with an energy Emma couldn't fully identify. She nodded, feeling adrenaline rushing through her veins. "I have everything I need. They won't get away with this." "I hope you're right," Henry said, sounding more hesitant than she expected. "Because there's something you don't know, something that could change everything." Before Emma could question him, the sound of an approaching car interrupted their conversation. It was Sarah. She was visibly shaken, nearly running to the meeting place. Emma furrowed her brow, unsure of what her friend wanted. "Emma," Sarah took a deep breath, clearly nervous. I've discovered something you need to know before you go through with this." Emma looked at her, skeptical, but motioned for her to continue. I went to Mark and he told me the truth about what really happened that night. It wasn't just about you, Emma. He was involved too. They all were." Emma's world froze for a second. Mark, the man she had exposed, the man whose lies and crimes she had revealed to the world. Emma felt her stomach twist as Sarah continued, avoiding direct eye contact. "I know you think it's all about revenge, about justice, but you don't understand. The whole town knew. Everyone was involved in that secret. They all played a part in what happened to you. And now you're not the only player in this game. Mark isn't the only guilty one, not even your parents." The revelation cut through Emma like a sharp knife. She looked at Henry, her mind spinning. He, who had been her ally until now, seemed too calm, as if he had known all along. "I knew you'd find out eventually," Henry said, with his trademark enigmatic smile. "Emma, you're an important piece, but you're not alone in this game. Mark, the whole town, they were just waiting for you to reach this point." She felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't. Everything she had done so far, all her actions, were being manipulated as part of a much bigger plan than she had ever imagined. The revenge she thought she was controlling now seemed like nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. "So you knew all of this, Henry?" Emma shouted, anger and frustration filling her voice. "You used me, manipulated me like everyone else." "Not exactly," Henry replied calmly, as if his answer were the most obvious thing in the world. "I helped you because you were the perfect vessel. You wanted revenge, and I wanted to see the town fall. It wasn't about you. It was about what they all represented. They ruined you, Emma, but I saw potential in you. I saw what you could do, and I wanted to be there with you when it happened." Henry's words cut deeper than any previous revelation. He didn't see her as an ally, but as a tool, a pawn in his own war. And in that moment, Emma knew that somehow she had never been the true protagonist. She had always been just a means to an end. The wind seemed to howl around them, as if the town itself was beginning to crumble under the weight of the revelation. Emma looked at Sarah, her eyes welling up with tears. She felt more lost than ever. What she had started was no longer a story of revenge. It was no longer a personal battle. She had been used, and perhaps worst of all, she had become part of something even more corrupt and dirty than she had imagined. I need to go," Emma said finally, her voice breaking. She didn't know where to go or what to do, but she felt like everything she had done so far was slipping through her fingers. Henry smiled, even more cryptic than before. "You can try to run, but there's no place left to hide, Emma. They know what you know. They've always known." The town now was not just a place of revenge. It was a battlefield, and Emma didn't know if she had the strength to fight anymore. The air in Cedar Falls was heavy, thick, like a storm about to break. Emma felt every step weigh heavily on the city's ground, as if she were carrying not just the burden of her own revenge, but that of an entire town corrupted by lies and fear. She knew nothing would ever be the same again, but now she wasn't sure what was left to do. After the conversation with Henry and Sarah, Emma walked away, seeking solitude, a corner where she could process everything she had just discovered. She was alone, but not for long. The truth, in some way, had spread faster than she had anticipated. Cedar Falls, that small town, was already buzzing, with rumors of the corruption that had seeped into its deepest structures circulating through the streets. Sarah, still stunned by the revelation, knew she had crossed an irreversible line. She had tried everything to avoid confronting Emma, but now she could no longer escape the consequences of her choices. She had gotten so deeply involved in the entire plot that although she hadn't been an active conspirator, she couldn't excuse herself from the guilt. She knew Emma wouldn't believe her, but she decided to find her. Sarah needed to try to make Emma understand that she wasn't like all the others. She wanted somehow to make amends for what she had done, but she knew it would be an uphill battle. For Emma, the pain of betrayal ran too deep. Nothing Sarah said or did could erase what had happened between them. Meanwhile, Henry was on his own journey of reflection. Though he had manipulated Emma in a calculated way, he now found himself in an even more complicated position. The revelation about Mark and the other town members didn't just affect Emma, it implicated everyone in some way, and the web he had helped weave was now entangling him as well. Cedar Falls was no longer just a place of vengeance, but a moral battleground where everyone seemed to be losing. Unlike Emma, who believed she had the truth and justice on her side, Henry knew that the consequences would be unpredictable. He allowed himself a moment of doubt. What did he really want after all? He wasn't as sure as he had been that the total destruction of Cedar Falls was the answer. When he had started this game, he thought everything would be simpler, that Emma's revenge was just a starting point for something bigger. Now he wasn't sure if he was helping to free the town or feeding a storm that couldn't be controlled. Meanwhile, Mark was desperately trying to regain control of the situation. He knew that the revelations about his involvement in Emma's past were just the beginning. Things were about to spiral out of control. He could no longer trust his allies, nor the members of his team. Those who had once been by his side now avoided him, and he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. That day, he met with the mayor, the woman who had always been his accomplice, but even she seemed more distant. Mark knew the town was in ruins, not just financially, but morally. They had been corrupted by the very system they had created, and now the facade was crumbling. "Do you really think we can control this, Mark?" the mayor asked, her expression one of someone who had already accepted that the town was beyond saving. "I don't know," he replied, his look grim, "but we'll try." However, the idea of trying was in reality a way of denying the inevitable. Mark already knew there was no hiding the secrets any longer. What he and the others had done was out in the open for everyone to see. They were being hunted not only by justice, but by their own fear of their guilt. The truth was like a monster, ready to devour them all. Emma, for her part, was retreating further and further into her own world. Sarah's and Henry's words echoed in her mind, but she didn't know who to trust anymore. The town was full of betrayals, and the people she thought she knew were really just pieces in a larger game than she had ever imagined. She had given everything for revenge, and now she didn't know how to turn back. What had started as a personal mission, a way to make sense of the pain and abandonment, was now becoming something bigger than she could control. Emma looked out at the streets of Cedar Falls from her window, watching the faces pass by, faces that had ignored her suffering, but now everyone could see the reflection of their own lies in their eyes. Revenge hadn't filled her like she thought it would. On the contrary, it had left her empty. Finally, Emma made a choice. It wouldn't be a choice of forgiveness or redemption, but one of not allowing others to control her anymore. She was going to the center of town, where the truth about Cedar Falls would be exposed once and for all. Everything she had kept hidden, all the evidence she had gathered over the years, would be shown to everyone. It would be the end, not of her revenge, but of a cycle of corruption and lies. But she knew it wouldn't be a victory. This wouldn't be a story with a simple or happy ending. She hadn't found justice. She had simply given everyone the truth. Now she would be like everyone else, lost in the middle of a system that was never built for the innocent. The town was in shock. The winds of truth had begun to blow hard, and no one was immune. Emma, knowing that her decision to expose all the secrets would be irreversible, felt a growing weight on her shoulders. What she didn't know, however, was that by doing this, not only would the truth be revealed, but the power of everyone involved in her game would begin to disintegrate before their very eyes. Sarah was desperate, trying to reach Emma before it was too late. She knew the young woman wouldn't be able to turn back. The decision to expose the town to the light of everything she had discovered was a desperate act. Sarah understood Emma's pain, and though she herself was part of the problem, she didn't want her friend to lose herself even more. She tried once more to find her, But Emma had already disappeared. Sarah was running against time and, once again, felt powerless. She knew she wouldn't be able to stop what was about to happen, but she still tried. "Emma, please, listen to me. Don't do this. You'll destroy yourself too," she thought, as she made her way to the town center, the place Emma had chosen for the big revelation. Emma, for her part, had decided to act without hesitation. She knew she was on the edge of a cliff, but she finally understood that revenge wouldn't set her free. She was no longer interested in a victory that would only destroy her in the process. She wanted something more, something that perhaps went beyond revenge itself. She wanted to show, for anyone willing to see, how the system that had destroyed her life and the lives of so many others had been rotten from the very start. As Emma approached the central square of Cedar Falls, she felt a mix of emotions. Her heart was racing, not with anger, but with a strange sense that she was finally taking control of her destiny. The square was as crowded as ever, but the atmosphere was different. Everyone knew something was about to happen. She could feel the eyes on her as she passed through the corridors, no longer hiding. Henry, who was now approaching the city center from a different direction, watched the scene from afar, silent and alert. Emma was about to make the biggest reveal of her life. He knew that no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same again. She was about to turn the tables. And at that moment he realized that he no longer controlled the game. He and Emma were just pieces in something much bigger. Their choices, their revelations, were beyond their control. The mayor and Mark were in the same situation. They both knew time was running out. The scandal was inevitable, but how much could they still control? How much were they willing to lose? They didn't know Emma had reached the center of town, but once they did, they knew they couldn't avoid the final confrontation. The lie that had supported the system had dissolved, and the city was bracing for collapse. "We're going to need more than apologies to get out of this, Mark," the mayor said, looking out the window of her office, arms crossed. She knew the city would never be the same, but she also knew there was a chance to still control the narrative if they played their cards right. "We need to act fast. If Emma gets the people together, if she shows the evidence of everything, it's over. We can't let that happen." Mark, in a state of panic that he rarely showed, nodded in agreement. He knew any move now had to be precise, or everything would be lost. But deep down, a part of him knew the tide couldn't be turned back. Emma finally reached the makeshift stage she'd set up in the central square. A small group of journalists was already there, but she didn't care about them. She wasn't there for a story. She was there to expose the truth to everyone. She took a deep breath, faced the growing crowd, and without hesitation began to speak. "I know you're all expecting something that will resolve things, give you answers. But I'm not here to offer that. I'm here to show you who really controls this city. The truth, as we all know, was never simple. But now you'll all have to face the consequences of the lies." She raised a stack of files containing documents, recordings, and proof of everything that had been hidden for years. She knew that by presenting that evidence, the city would be changed forever. This was the last chance for everyone to see the reality of a system corroded by corruption and fear. This is the system that Mark, the mayor, and many others built on the pain and suffering of the most vulnerable. I was a victim, but I'm no longer a victim. I'm here because I know what was done to me, and I know what we all allowed to happen. But more than that, I'm here to give a voice to those who never had a chance to speak, to those who were never given the opportunity to be heard. The silence in the square was deep. Emma looked out at the crowd, feeling the weight of her words. There was no turning back. The city had already reached a point of no return. The square was completely silent, a palpable tension hanging in the air. All eyes were on Emma, who was now at the heart of the city, before an audience she never imagined would be gathered this way. Their eyes were fixed on her, waiting perhaps for her to give in to the pressure, for her to surrender, to regret the choice she had made. But Emma wasn't there to apologize. She was there to make the final move, the move that would change everything. This was the final moment, the climax of a life of pain, of waiting, of revenge. She had placed all the pieces of the story in place, and now, finally, the pieces fit. She had the truth in her hands, and no one could deny it. These files, these proofs, are a reflection of a system that not only destroyed me, but destroyed the lives of many others here. And all of you, in one way or another, are complicit in this game. Emma's voice was firm, but her gaze was distant, almost empty. She knew what she was doing wouldn't bring healing, but at least it would bring justice. Sarah was in the crowd, off to the side, waiting for an opening to approach Emma. She felt the need to speak, to explain everything she had done, to ask for forgiveness for her omissions. But Emma was relentless. The young woman seemed to have become a force of nature. Nothing could stop her now. Henry, who was among the crowd, stood still, motionless. He had come with the intention of trying to intervene, of making Emma rethink her decision, but the truth was clear. He knew he could no longer manipulate the events. When Emma began revealing the first pieces of evidence, he realized the reins had slipped from his hands. As Emma showed the documentation proving the corruption, the bribery, and the shady dealings involving Mark, the mayor, and other officials, the impact was immediate. The city was in shock. Shouts began to echo. Some people still tried to deny it, but most were already looking at the involved parties, waiting for them to explain themselves. At that moment, Mark, who had stayed in the background until then, decided to make what might be his last attempt to take control. He stood up, his nervous eyes moving between the crowd and Emma. He knew the situation was out of control, but he still had a card to play, or at least he thought he did. "Emma, you don't know what you're doing," he yelled, his voice full of anger. "Do you think this will bring you peace? It's only going to destroy all of us. Don't you understand that the system needs order? It needs stability. If you destroy everything, what will be left of us?" The crowd went silent for a moment, but Emma didn't back down. She stared at Mark with a look that could have toppled an army. "You talk about stability, Mark? When did the people of Cedar Falls ever have stability? When did anyone outside your circles ever have a chance? The order you defend only serves those who already have power. The stability you're talking about is a disguise for the lie." Mark, realizing he couldn't turn the situation around, glanced at those around him. The mayor's face was pale, and he knew she had nothing left to say. She, just like him, was now part of the story of disillusionment that Emma had created. The city was about to collapse, and everyone there would be a part of its downfall. But Henry, who had stayed at a distance until that moment, stepped forward. He looked directly at Emma, his expression filled with regret and helplessness. "Emma, please, it's not too late to change this. It doesn't have to be like this. I've made mistakes, many mistakes, but you don't have to destroy the entire city to do what's right." Emma watched him, what seemed like an eternity, as he tried to approach her. His presence, once dominant, now seemed more like a shadow. He didn't understand how much he had lost. He didn't grasp the depth of the pain she carried. "You still think you can save me, Henry, after everything you've done? Don't come to me with excuses now. You're just trying to save yourself." Emma's response was cold, direct, with no room for regret. Henry, with his heart heavy, took a step back. He knew she was beyond his reach now. It had been him, in the end, who had forced her to become this person, this version of herself that wasn't seeking redemption, just justice. With the square divided between those who were now seeing the evidence and those who still hesitated to believe, Emma took a final step. She raised the documents one last time before throwing everything into the air. The papers fluttered in the wind, scattering across the square like dry leaves. Now, everyone gets what they deserve. It was at that moment that, from the back of the square, the sound of sirens began to grow closer. It was the police, but not to arrest Emma. They were coming to arrest Mark, the mayor, and all the people involved in the scheme that Emma had exposed. They were arriving too late, but they were coming with the truth in hand. Sarah finally managed to get close to Emma. She placed a hand on her shoulder, but Emma didn't turn around. "Emma, I wish I had done something earlier. to prevent all of this. But you're right. Now it's too late. Emma looked at her, and for a brief moment, something like a tear appeared in her eyes. But she quickly brushed it away. No, Sarah, there's no turning back. This is all that's left. Now, it's the end. I don't have anything else to wait for. The city, with all its secrets and lies, stood on the brink of a new era, an era of discovery and perhaps redemption. But the price Emma paid had been too high. The days following Emma's public revelation weren't easy. Cedar Falls would never be the same. Investigations began immediately, and the corruption that had infiltrated every layer of the city's administration started to crumble. People spoke with a mixture of relief and fear, knowing that justice was finally being served, but also fearing the changes it would bring to their lives. The truth always comes with a price, and Emma's price was far too high. The mayor and Mark were arrested. The image of both of them being led away in handcuffs by the police became a symbol of a transformed city. But, contrary to what many had imagined, there was no celebration. The population was frightened by what had been revealed. The layers of lies about the city, the manipulations, and the abuses that had been committed were deeper than anyone could have imagined. Sarah, who had tried to intervene to stop Emma from doing what she did, felt lost. She knew she couldn't change what had already happened, but she couldn't shake the guilt weighing on her shoulders. She tried to find Emma several times, but the young woman withdrew, seeking something more important than Sarah's feelings. She was deep down seeking her own peace. Emma knew that vengeance wouldn't bring healing, but she couldn't just ignore what the city had done to her and others like her. She had exposed the rot of the system, but she didn't find the satisfaction she had expected. After all, justice wasn't something she could achieve with a simple act of exposure. True change came with time, and Emma understood that, but she knew she had to move on. The city, now without the pillars that once supported it, found itself in a state of uncertainty. New elections would be called, and Cedar Falls would need to rebuild from the ruins left by corruption, but the scars would be permanent. Emma, for her part, stepped away from the city, aimless, but with the feeling that, at least, she could start a new life away from everything that had bound her. She knew she would never be the same person, but somehow, that no longer bothered her. She had the sense that at last she was in control of her own story. Sarah, unlike Emma, stayed. She felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, but she also knew that despite everything that had happened, she could still try to fix the mistakes she had made. She committed herself to ensuring that the suffering of Emma and so many others wouldn't fade with time. Gradually, Sarah began to fight for a more just Cedar Falls, free from the shadows of corruption. Henry, with the fall of Mark and the mayor, saw his own downfall as a consequence. However, he also knew that loss was part of the process. He no longer had control over the events, but something inside him told him that perhaps it was time to find a new path to redemption. Emma had shown him that, even though it might be too late for some regrets, there was still room for change if he was willing to face himself. And Cedar Falls, a city forever marked, began to rebuild. But the memory of what had happened would never be erased. For Emma, for Sarah, for everyone involved, the city would always represent the struggle for truth and the weight of vengeance, which in the end transformed into something more complex. The search for justice and the attempt to find peace in a world that had long been fueled by lies. Years later, Cedar Falls still carried the scars of the Great Revelation. Although corruption had been eradicated and new leaders tried to restore trust, the memory of the scandal never fully disappeared. Emma, now living in a distant town, rebuilt her life without ever forgetting the pain that had driven her to fight. She had found peace in a way she hadn't expected, not through vengeance, but by the freedom that the truth had given her. Sarah, on the other hand, became a human rights advocate in the city, reminding everyone that true justice goes beyond punishment. The story of Emma and Cedar Falls serves as a powerful reminder of how truth, even painful, has the power to transform everything around us. The scars of the past, though deep, do not have to define our future, but the way we choose to deal with them does. What lessons have you learned along this journey? What would you do if you were in Emma's or Sarah's place? Share your reflections and inspire others to seek truth, justice, and above all, the capacity for change. Don't let the stories of pain fade away without a more meaningful end.